James chapter 5, if you look at verses 16 to 18, it's talking about effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man, that it avails much, it accomplishes a lot. And the context here includes Elijah, who was also a righteous man who prayed, and his prayers were powerful. And so Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain in the land for 3 years and 6 months. And he prayed again, and the heaven gave rain, and the earth produced fruit. So if you know the story, he's been being raised up and prepared as a prophet. And finally the day comes where he gives his first prophecy. He's been wanting to prophesy. God's been training him, equipping him. So now's his first prophecy, and he goes to the king and he prophesies, "It will not rain until I say it rains." That's his first prophecy. And rather than applauding, they said, "Kill that guy, get him, grab him." And he runs away. Now, Elijah is a man just like you. He has the same nature as you, the same emotional needs, he has a soul, he has physical needs. He's just like you. We make him out to be a superhero, and James says you're going to miss it. If you think of him as a superhero, you're going to miss it. He's not a superhero. He's just like you. In nature, in needs, emotions, he's a person. Now go with me. Here's what happened. He prophesies and then he flees. And he gets down into this creek bed. And he gets down in, he hides among the bulrushes. You can hear horses running by and people shouting, "He went this way. Check this out. Go down that ravine. Hey, you, go this way. Go up in that mountain. There's a cave up there. Check that out." He could hear all this activity. And he gets down and he hunkers in and he begins to wait. I spent almost a month one time on a river, and rivers stink. The mud stinks. It stinks. It gets on your clothes. It stinks. There's something about a riverbank that stinks. I picture him that night. His eyes are wide. He's listening to every sound. Probably doesn't sleep that night. He doesn't know how. We know how it's going to end, but he doesn't know how it's going to end. He just knows the king said, "Kill him." So maybe the first night he just sat among the bulrushes listening all his senses. And his senses are like your senses. They're just tingling. They're just totally on alert. Talk about stress. He's just ready to bolt. And nothing happens. The next morning he takes some water in, can't build a fire, can't catch fish, can't stand to stretch, can't stand up like he normally would to really stretch because he doesn't want to be seen. He just has to stay low. All there is the sound of crickets or insects, the odd frog, people shouting, horses, hear the sound of hooves. And you wait all day. Waiting all day by yourself in a riverbed is a really, really long day. And then it starts to get dark and it starts to get cold. Maybe he takes some bulrushes and breaks them down and makes a bit of a mattress just to keep out of the mud. You can smell the mud. You can taste the mud. You get mud on you when you go down to get a drink. And he doesn't know how this thing is going to turn out, how it's going to end. And that night, just before the sunset, this raven came flying up to him. And he watches it. And it's getting bigger and bigger. And it's got a biscuit in his mouth. And the thing hovers right above him and just hovers there. And he could just reach up and take the biscuit. And another one comes by that's got a piece of meat. And it hovers and he takes it and he's got his first meal. And that helps pass the time, and you nibble on it. You want to stretch it out. Maybe save a little piece to later. You don't know if that's your last meal. He finds a little water, and he spends another cold, lonely night. The next day, the sun starts coming up. It feels good, but he can't really move around. He'd love to go for a walk. There's just something about just going for a walk and getting out and seeing something different, another place, another location. Be able to look around and see what the activity is, see what the buzz is, see what people are saying. He can't run the risk of being caught. He can't be with anybody. And that first day, he prayed everything he knew to pray, and now he's in a place beyond prayer where there's nothing more to say. And it's a powerful place to live. It's something, your soul and his soul are connected. You feel his presence and there's no words, and you just, maybe you groan or maybe you say, oh God, and there's really, his things to do list is really short. There's not much to pray about. There's no relationship conflicts. There's no plans to pray through. There's not much to say to God. And God's not a big talker in the sense of that he just talks for the sake of talking. So there's not much being said. So he can't really pray like he would normally pray. There's nothing to read. He'd give anything for a scrap of parchment, just something to fill his mind with. You're there all day and all night. And that morning, a raven came flying in and hovered above him. And he reached up and he took out another piece of bread and another piece of meat. And twice a day, those ravens came and fed him. And he drank from the brook. But eventually, the brook began to dry up, and it was getting harder to find a place to belly down and to really drink, and it was starting to really stink, and the bank was cracking and dry, and you didn't hear any more frogs, and it just got quieter and quieter, and it went on, and he watched the river die. He watched the river dry up. James says that he waited 3.5 years. We don't know how long it takes for a river to dry up exactly. But it was a sizable portion. Now remember, he's a man just like you. He likes to be with people. He likes to be with his friends. He loves movie night. He loves popcorn. He loves all the stuff that you love. But he can't have any of it. It's just waiting for a release from the Lord. And then one morning, he woke up and there's hardly any water. Hardly enough to brush your teeth. And he waited for the ravens to come. Maybe he named them by this point in time, and he just was expecting them. And they didn't come, and they didn't come. And it was getting like on past noon. You could see the sun. And he says, Lord, where's where's breakfast? And the Lord spoke to him for the first time. He said, I've prepared another place for you to go, and I've commanded a widow woman to provide for you. Here's the direction. Here's the name of the town. And I think when the Lord said the name of the town, I bet Elijah gasped and then maybe laughed. And he says, you can leave today. We don't know how long he was there. Let's say he was there a year, maybe a year and a half. His clothes are just rotting off his back, and he's skinnier than he's ever been. And he climbs out, he looks around, he doesn't see or hear anything, and he begins walking, and it feels so good to walk, and he walks toward the town. And the town is the hometown of Jezebel. The last place that anyone would look, because you'd have to be insane to hide in Jezebel's town when she's the one that's looking for your head. And he walks in the town and he sees this woman gathering sticks. She's got a little boy there, and they're picking up a little bit of sticks, and he must have been a sight. And he asked for some water. When she turned around to go get some water, he said, bring me some food. And she said, I'm picking up sticks for my last meal. I got a little bit of grain, a little bit of flour, a little bit of oil, and I'm just preparing the last biscuit for me and my boy. And he did something that no pastor or preacher would ever want to do. It doesn't make sense, but he knows God. He's in that waiting period. There's been something that has passed into his soul. He's more in sync with God's heart, more in sync with his name, his nature, his mind than ever before, more sensitive. He just becomes like God in the sense he said, make that biscuit for me. But he doesn't have a selfish bone in his body. He knows that this is the way for her to survive. He knows that if she gives, it shall be given to her. But she has to take that first step. It's radical, it's crazy, it's insane. It's not selfish, but he says, make it for me. And you look at the stranger who smells like a riverbank, whose clothes are rotten. He looks like a homeless man. And you look at your boy, and you look at your food, and you look at your oil, and you decide that you obey what this man says, a stranger, what he's going to require of you. And when she said yes in her heart, he said, the meal will never run dry and the oil will never run out. And it was true. And he went in and he was able to be in that house. And I picture him up in this loft, and he's on a cot for the first time. He's on a bed. He's got a candle that he can light. He hasn't had any light, no fireplace, no fire for months and months, maybe years. And he can hear them downstairs talking or scurrying or pumping a well or drawing water. He can hear the neighbors, and he's in his little loft. And again, he's got a choice. He can lay, he can kneel, he can sit. But there's not much to do. There's not much to say. There's not much to eat. There's not much to satisfy your soul. And he's a man just like you. He loves to have stimulation, conversation, fellowship. And he waits. And James says he waited 3.5 years. And the way waiting works, it's flatline. It always works this way. It's flatline. Then the Lord speaks, and it gets really busy. And your heart goes through the roof. And you go from nothing to the Lord telling you something that you could die if you did it. One morning he wakes up, the Lord says, go tell the king, I want to see him. Go tell the king it's going to rain. go anoint this person, do that, make this person the next king. I mean, he was busy in an instant. So he goes from flatline to having to go face Ahab to in person. The guy who could take off his head. And it's just that way where it gets real busy real fast, and it's challenging stuff. But you do it. You learn something about the heart of God. You learn something about His name, His nature in the waiting. And he said, it's going to rain at my command. And it didn't look like it. Even when he prophesied it, it didn't look like anything was happening. And they had to wait, and finally they saw a little fist of rain coming off the Mediterranean, coming toward Carmel. I mean, it's just, it's a work of waiting. And we lose lots of young people. We lose lots of people who have real calls on their life because they don't like to wait. We're the generation that taps our toe at the microwave oven because it's too slow. We can hardly go through a car wash. It's just too slow. We can't stand to be 2 car lengths into a drive-through where you throw your money in a window and they throw food out because we don't even have time to go in and sit down. And that's too slow. So how are we going to get people to wait? And God says, waiting, it's part of it. It's what I do. It's what I want. And I'm not doing it to punish you. I'm doing it to be gracious to you. I'm doing it so that I will be glorified. You'll say, it was God, it was God, it was God. I can't, but He can. You come to the end of yourself. Your whole motives change. Your mind changes. The way you think, the way you operate completely changes. But it happens in the waiting. And it's lonely. And we hate loneliness so much that there are people who just put on music and noise just because we can't stand just to be alone. And they're missing out on an ingredient that comes in silence, comes in wilderness, dry times. Churches go through dry times, pastors go through dry times, prophets go through dry times. It's part of it. There's no way to avoid it. It's God. It's His way. He wasn't punishing Moses. He wasn't punishing Elijah. He wasn't punishing David. David is anointed and oils running down his face and onto his garments because Samuel anointed him as king of Israel. And then for the next 10 years, he's chased around the backside of the wilderness by a mad king who's got 3,000 men trying to bring him down, and he's running from rabbit hole to rabbit hole, just barely. Just sometimes he's on one side of the mountain and the king's on the other side of the mountain. But David is being transformed. David is getting not just a new name, a new nature. He's getting a message. He's getting a heart. He's getting songs. He's getting revelation. His prayers start to merge with Jesus' prayers on the cross. But it happens in the wilderness. Meanwhile, all he can do is every now and again he can smell the anointing oil and say, I know I'm supposed to be king, but where is it? How come it's not happening? And even when he finally became king, only one part of the nation ordained him as king, and he had to wait another 7 years for it finally to all come together, and he gets anointed a second time. It's just part of what God does. And if you don't know that, you think it's punishment, or you failed, or He's being mean, or you've somehow disqualified yourself. And then it's filled with temptation, because temptation is part of the wilderness, and it's filled with loneliness. but it's normal. It's where men and messages are formed. It's part of the process. And we hate the wait. You're not the only one. Elijah hated the wait. David hated the wait. Moses hated the wait. The disciples were told, don't leave Jerusalem until you're endued with power. And it was 50 days of waiting. And you've prayed everything you know to pray in the first day. And it's just waiting. And it really looks like nothing's happening. In fact, there was a moment where Peter said, that's it. I go a-fishing. And when he said I go a-fishing, it's not for leisure. It's not for bass. It's I'm going in business again. I'm going back to my business. I'm going back to what I know provides. He has a wife. He has children. We know Peter was married. Some of the other disciples likely were married. We know Judas was married. Peter's got a mother-in-law. There's no point in having a mother-in-law unless you're married. I mean, wouldn't that be a bummer? I mean, Peter's married. He says, I go a-fishing. And 2 or 3 of the other disciples says, we're going with you. And it's really going back to business. I'm going to do what I know. I've got to make a living. I got to do something. I can't just stay here. It looks like nothing's happening. So if you can imagine Peter, he gets a boat and he goes out and the idea is to fish all night. And by this time he's been camping with Jesus about 3.5 years. He's lost all of his calluses and he thrusts his big fingers in the nets and throws them over the side of the boat, and now they're just ripping the skin off. I mean, he hasn't worked. He's feeling muscles he hasn't felt in a long time. And he throws these big heavy nets, and then what you do is you put your fingers in and you begin drawing them back in after they've settled to the bottom with these weights, and you begin drawing them back in. It's back-breaking work. And you put your fingers in there, and you bring hauling hand over hand. You're feeling muscles in your back and your shoulders and your neck that you haven't felt for a long time. And they're hauling, and they haul them all in, and there's not a minnow, not a sardine. And you look at each other, and you're exhausted, and finally you say, yeah. You can't even talk at this point in time. You just begin grabbing nets and throwing them back in the lake. Throwing them back in and waiting for them to sink down, and then, okay, you nod. You're not even talking at this time. You begin hauling them back in, and they haul them back in, and not a sardine, nothing. And then they look at each other like, are you kidding me? And they do it all night long. It's a long, cold, hungry night. And they begin rowing towards shore. And there's a slight mist on the lake because the temperature difference, and they're moving in almost silently. And they look over, and there's this man hunched over some coals on the shore. Big cape and floppy hat. And he calls out, and his voice carries across the top of the water, and you can hear it crystal clear. And he says, hey boys, have you caught anything? And they look at each other, they shake their head, and one of them said, nada, nothing. And then the voice says, cast your nets on the other side of the boat. And they look at each other like, we've been fishing all night. How crazy is that? And for whatever reason, they did it. And all of a sudden the nets lunged to the bottom and just about tipped the boat over, just about sunk. The water is boiling with fish, and they can hardly keep from sinking. And they look at each other, and John says, "It's the Lord." And Peter dives in the water and walks up on shore. And here's this man, and he's got this section of coals. He's got some fish on it. He's got some bread on it. And all you hear is Peter's sandals underneath on top of the gravel crunching. And he's standing there dripping wet, panting, looking at this guy who he doesn't recognize. And the guy's just flipping fish and flipping big pieces of round bread, flat bread, beautiful flat bread on these beautiful coals. And he's just flipping fish, doesn't even look up. Peter's just standing there panting and looking at him. The other disciples are laboring to try to bring in the nets and get them up on shore. And the man says, bring some more fish. And Peter runs back and grabs, and they start counting them. There's 153 really big fish. And Peter comes up holding onto the gills of some fish, and the man takes them and just lays them out, scales and all, just right on the coals. Takes a piece of bread and breaks it and takes a steaming hot piece of white flaky fish from one of the fish that he'd already been cooking, and he hands it to Peter, and Peter's standing there, and it's warmth and it's food, and they haven't eaten, and he can hardly eat. And Jesus is breaking off more bread and more fish, and he hands it out to the handful of men who are standing there, and they're all just standing there looking at him and trying to figure out the scene and trying to figure out what happened. And he doesn't say anything. All you hear is gravel and sizzling of the fish, and you smell the bread. And so they stand there, and they're eating hot bread and hot fish, and they're waiting, they're looking, and nothing happens. And one of the greatest reproofs in all the Bible is about to happen. And there's no one who can reprove you like Jesus, who's so loving and who's so gracious. And oftentimes his reproofs are with kindness, and they're with generosity, and you know you missed it and you don't deserve it, but he has a way of saying something so simple and so to the heart of the issue. And as they stand there eating, finally he looks at Peter, and they have eye contact, and he says, "Peter, do you love me more than these?" And he points to the fish. He's not talking about the other disciples, because Jesus would never do that. You can't judge another man's heart. You don't know the love of another man for the Lord. We get that wrong all the time. But the fish represent business and doing your own thing and not being willing to wait. It's your own effort. It's your own thinking. It's your own reason. It's your insecurities, your need for security, your need for money, your need to do something. He says, "Do you love me more than these?" And Peter's speechless, because it just puts the finger right on his heart. He couldn't wait. And he can't hardly swallow, and he says, you know I love you. And then it just goes back to silence and flatline. We don't know how long passed, but they're still eating, and finally his voice breaks the silence, and he says, "Peter, do you love me more than these?" And he's asking the same question as the same fish, and feed my sheep, feed my lambs. The third time he said it, Peter completely broke. I bet he just said it with sobs. You know my heart. You know I love you. I don't think he can even really finishes it. But it's a message he never, ever forgot. It's a message that went so deep because he couldn't wait. He couldn't obey. He's a disciple, and discipleship is all about obedience. It's all about doing what you're told. It's all about doing what Jesus says. And he couldn't. And it's about his calling. It's about feeding sheep. It's about living for others and feeding lambs, taking care of lambs. And it's one of the most powerful reproofs in the Bible. And he's reproved me that way before. The reason I know the story is I know the reproof. But there's all kinds of people in the Bible. There's all kinds of people who had calls. Joseph gets called to greatness as a teenager and then spends most of his youth, his developmental years, in a prison. It's all about waiting. Jeremiah the whole story is about waiting. The story of Jesus is about waiting. And it's part of your story, but you have to learn not to hate it. You have to learn to expect it. You have to learn to appreciate it. And after a while, when the waiting, you get so far out in the real waiting that when the call comes to get busy, you can hardly pull out into that other gear because you love waiting so much. You realize that it's a good thing. But he'll call you out of waiting. He'll bring you along. The best stories I've ever heard about waiting. A young mother in our church heard me teach this, and we had meetings. We had about 9 months of mostly waiting upon the Lord, like last night, where you just wait, the worship sound is playing, and there's not much to do, and there's really no call to action until all of a sudden everything got busy and people get prayed for and people get baptized in the Spirit and healed in the last 10 minutes of the meeting or so. But for the most part, the whole meeting, several hours every night for about 9 months, was just waiting. And the kids were not having a hard time with it. And they asked their mom, "What are we doing? Why do we wait? What's the waiting?" And she asked the Lord how to explain waiting to the kids. And she said, the Lord told her to tell them that it was like making macaroni. And macaroni is mostly about waiting. You boil the water, and you put the water on the stove, and nothing happens. For the longest time, nothing happens. And if you watch a cooking pot, it just seems even longer. And maybe the odd bubble will come up, and you're standing there waiting and waiting and waiting, and finally a couple more bubbles and a few more bubbles, and then the water begins to stir a little bit. And finally, all of a sudden, it's turbulent, it's bubbling, it's really, really active, and you pour the pasta, you pour the macaroni in there, and it goes flatline. You'll even stir it just to do something. And it looks like for the longest time, you don't know it, but the pasta is being changed. There's a hardness and there's something about the pasta that needs to go through a process, and it's going to become useful. It's going to become edible, but it looks like, for the most part, like nothing's happening. And it really is like making macaroni, where it's lots of flat line, then turbulent. You do a couple activities and goes back to flat line. It really is that way. And that mother was Tish. You were one of the little girls who was asking, why do we have to wait in these meetings? And the Lord said it's like making macaroni. I never forgot it, because it's like making macaroni. It's a perfect illustration for waiting upon the Lord. Amen? Forgive me, I've gone by the time we set.